There is a photograph that hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It shows a man with the most famous face in silent cinema, a face that never smiled, that became iconic precisely because of its stillness, its refusal to betray emotion even in the most chaotic circumstances. The photograph was taken in 1930, at the height of what should have been Buster Keaton's triumph. He had just signed the most lucrative contract in Hollywood history. He was being called the greatest physical comedian who ever lived. His films were being studied by critics who believed they represented the pinnacle of what cinema could achieve. Look closer at that photograph. Look past the famous stone face, past the flat pork pie hat, past the perfectly composed exterior. Look at the eyes. The eyes are already dead. Within 2 years of that photograph, Buster Keaton would lose everything. His studio would take away his creative control. His wife would take away his children. His alcoholism would take away his dignity. The industry that had celebrated him as a genius would discard him as unemployable, a relic of a silent era that sound had made obsolete. He would spend the next 2 decades as a ghost, haunting the edges of an industry that had forgotten him. He would work as an uncredited gag writer, feeding jokes to lesser talents who did not know they were being helped by a master. He would appear in degrading short films that mocked the very skills that had once made him legendary. He would drink himself nearly to death, then drink some more. This is the story of the man they called the Great Stone Face, not because he chose not to smile, but because life had taught him that smiling was a luxury he could not afford. The story of a child who was thrown across stages by his father before he could walk. The story of a genius who built impossible machines and performed impossible stunts and created impossible beauty, then watched it all burn while Hollywood looked the other way. Buster Keaton made the world laugh. The world did not return the favor. Joseph Frank Keaton was born on October 4th, 1895, in Piqua, Kansas, into a world of sawdust and grease paint, and the particular kind of desperation that drives people to perform for strangers. His parents, Joe and Myra, were vaudeville performers, a comedy team that traveled the country, playing whatever theater would have them, sleeping in boarding houses, eating when they could afford to, performing the same routines night after night for audiences who had paid a few cents for the privilege of forgetting their own troubles. The legend says that Harry Houdini gave young Joseph his nickname. The great escape artist was a friend of the family, and when the 6-month-old baby tumbled down a flight of stairs without crying, without even seeming to notice the fall, Houdini supposedly exclaimed, "That was a real Buster." The name stuck. It was not the last time Buster Keaton would fall. His entire childhood was a series of falls, calculated, rehearsed, performed for paying audiences who did not realize they were watching a form of child abuse disguised as entertainment. Joe Keaton discovered early that audiences loved watching his son get hurt. The smaller the child, the bigger the laugh, so he incorporated young Buster into the act, using him as a prop, a projectile, a human mophead to be grabbed by the hair and hurled across the stage, bounced off walls, dropped from heights that would have injured any normal child. Buster learned to fall before he learned to read. He learned to take punishment before he learned to speak in complete sentences. He learned that his pain was entertainment, that his suffering was worth money, that his value as a human being was measured entirely by his ability to absorb damage and keep moving. The act was called The Three Keatons, and it was brutal. Joe would grab his son by a handle sewn into his costume and throw him into the scenery, into the orchestra pit, into the audience itself. Night after night, city after city, Buster was the prop that screamed and the audiences that laughed. Except Buster did not scream. He learned early that screaming made the audiences uncomfortable, made them feel guilty about laughing at a child's pain. So he developed the stone face, the expressionless mask that would become his trademark, that would make him famous, that was really just a survival mechanism developed by a boy who had learned that showing emotion was bad for business. The secret is, Buster would explain decades later, you don't fight the fall. You become the fall. You let your body go completely loose, and you trust that you know how to land. The moment you tense up, the moment you resist, that's when you get hurt. He was talking about physical comedy. He was also talking about his entire approach to life. By the time Buster was 21, vaudeville was dying and movies were being born. He wandered into a film studio in 1917, met a comedian named Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, and discovered the medium that would make him immortal and destroy him in roughly equal measure. He understood film immediately, instinctively, in a way that most performers of his generation never did. Where others saw a camera as a replacement for a theater audience, Buster saw it as something entirely new, a way to create visual jokes that could not exist on stage, to build elaborate physical gags that required the precision of cinema to execute. Within 2 years he was making his own films. Within 5 years he was being called a genius. The films were astonishing. They remain astonishing. In Sherlock Jr., Buster played a projectionist who dreams himself into a movie, and the sequence where he interacts with shifting film backgrounds remains one of the most technically innovative pieces of cinema ever created. In The General, he staged a Civil War battle with real trains, real explosions, and real danger, a film that cost more than any comedy had ever cost, and created images that have never been surpassed. But it was the stunts that defined him. Buster Keaton did things on camera that should have killed him, that would have killed anyone else, that still make audiences gasp nearly a century later. In Steamboat Bill Jr., the facade of a building falls on him, a real facade, weighing thousands of pounds, with a single window positioned to pass over his body as he stands perfectly still. One miscalculation, one gust of wind, one slight variation in position, and Buster Keaton would have been crushed to death on camera. He did not flinch. He never flinched. The stone face held because the stone face always held, because showing fear would ruin the joke, because Buster Keaton had learned as a child that his feelings were irrelevant, that only the performance mattered. By 1928, Buster Keaton was one of the most successful filmmakers in the world. His own studio, where he had complete creative control, had produced a string of masterpieces that critics and audiences adored. He was wealthy beyond anything his vaudeville childhood could have imagined. He had a mansion, a wife, 2 sons, and the respect of everyone who understood what cinema could be. He was also desperately unhappy, though he would not have known how to articulate that unhappiness, would not have had the vocabulary for it. His marriage to Natalie Talmadge had become a cold arrangement, a business partnership from which all warmth had long since evaporated. His relationship with his sons was distant. He did not know how to be a father because no one had ever shown him how, because his own father had used him as a prop rather than raising him as a child. But the work was good. The work was always good. As long as Buster could make films on his own terms, he could survive anything else. Then MGM made him an offer he could not refuse, or rather an offer that everyone around him insisted he could not refuse. His brother-in-law, his business manager, his wife, all the people who were supposed to be looking out for his interests, but were really looking out for their own. The offer was simple: leave his independent studio and sign with MGM, the biggest studio in Hollywood. He would receive a salary larger than any comedian had ever earned. He would have access to resources and production values that his small studio could never match. He would become part of the most powerful entertainment machine in the world. The price was everything that had made him great. "It was the worst mistake of my life," Buster said later, with the flat delivery that made it impossible to tell if he was joking or confessing. "I gave away my independence for money. I sold my freedom to people who didn't understand the first thing about comedy." MGM did not want Buster Keaton, the auteur, the filmmaker who controlled every aspect of his productions, who spent months perfecting gags, who believed that physical comedy was an art form worthy of the same respect as any other. MGM wanted Buster Keaton, the product, the name that could be attached to films produced quickly and cheaply, the face that would sell tickets regardless of what was behind it. They assigned him writers who did not understand visual comedy. They assigned him directors who did not understand that the performer should have control over the gags. They took away the elaborate construction and the dangerous stunts and the obsessive perfectionism that had made his independent films masterpieces and replaced them with generic plots and talking pictures that negated his greatest strength. Buster Keaton had built his entire art form on silence, on the eloquence of a face that never spoke, on physical poetry that needed no words. Sound films destroyed that art form as completely as fire destroys paper. His first talking pictures for MGM were disasters. Not because Buster could not speak, his voice was fine, unremarkable but serviceable, but because the addition of dialogue meant the subtraction of everything else. The elaborate physical sequences that had defined his genius were replaced with scenes of people standing around talking. The stone face that had communicated volumes in silence now seemed merely blank, as if the sound had stolen something essential from him. The studio blamed Buster. Of course they blamed Buster. It could not be that their system was wrong, that their assembly line approach to filmmaking was incapable of producing art, that they had taken a genius and forced him to work like a factory employee. The problem must be Buster himself. Difficult, outdated, unable to adapt to the new reality of talking pictures. Within 3 years of signing with MGM, Buster Keaton was finished in Hollywood. The drinking had always been there, lurking in the background of his life like a family curse. His father had been a drunk, a mean drunk, a violent drunk, a drunk whose alcoholism had eventually destroyed the vaudeville act and left the family with nothing. Buster had watched that destruction and sworn he would never follow the same path. He followed the same path, as MGM systematically dismantled his career, as his marriage collapsed into mutual contempt, as his children were taken from him by a wife who had decided he was no longer useful. Buster drank. He drank to forget the humiliations of the studio. He drank to forget the silence of his empty mansion. He drank because drinking was what Keaton's did when life became unbearable, and his life had become very unbearable indeed. MGM fired him in 1933. The official reason was that he was unreliable, that his drinking made him impossible to work with, that he had become a liability rather than an asset. The real reason was that they had extracted everything valuable from him and saw no reason to continue the arrangement. He was 37 years old. He had been famous for 15 years. He had created some of the greatest works of art that cinema had ever produced. And now he was unemployable, divorced, separated from his children, and drinking himself toward a death that seemed increasingly attractive. The next decade was a blur of degradation. He made short films for educational pictures, cheap productions that paid almost nothing and treated him like a relic. He appeared in foreign films that no one in America would ever see. He worked as an uncredited gag writer for other comedians, sitting in rooms and feeding jokes to performers who did not realize they were receiving charity from a master. "I was a ghost," he said later. "I haunted Hollywood. People would see me and look away, like they were embarrassed that I still existed. I was a reminder of something they wanted to forget." In 1940, at the absolute bottom of his spiral, Buster Keaton met Eleanor Norris. She was 21 years old, a dancer at MGM, young enough to be his daughter. He was 44, broken, alcoholic, seemingly beyond any possibility of redemption. Eleanor saw something in him that he could no longer see in himself. She saw the genius beneath the degradation, the artist beneath the alcoholism, the human being beneath the stone face that had become a prison rather than a mask. They married within months. It was Buster's third marriage, and he had every reason to expect it to fail as the previous two had failed. Instead, it saved his life. Eleanor understood what Buster needed in a way that no one before her had understood. She did not try to change him. She did not lecture him about his drinking. She simply loved him, consistently, unconditionally, with a patience that seemed almost infinite. She created a home where he felt safe, where he did not have to perform, where he could simply exist without being judged for his failures. The drinking did not stop immediately. It took years of Eleanor's steady presence, years of small victories and devastating relapses, years of learning that sobriety was a daily choice rather than a permanent achievement. But gradually, painfully, Buster Keaton clawed his way back from the edge of the abyss. He was still a ghost in Hollywood. The industry that had discarded him showed no signs of wanting him back, but for the first time in decades, he had a reason to stay alive. The rediscovery began slowly, so slowly that Buster himself did not recognize it at first. In the late 1940s, film scholars began to write about the silent era with a new respect, analyzing the work of Chaplin and Keaton and Lloyd as art rather than mere entertainment. They screened the old films for audiences who had never seen them, and those audiences responded with amazement. These weren't primitive curiosities, they were masterpieces. By the 1950s, Buster Keaton was being talked about as a genius who had been criminally undervalued, a victim of Hollywood's transition to sound, an artist whose work deserved to stand alongside the greatest achievements in cinema. The same industry that had thrown him away was beginning to wonder if it had made a terrible mistake. Television, ironically, completed his resurrection. The medium that was destroying the movie business gave Buster something movies no longer would: regular work. He appeared on variety shows, performed his old physical routines for audiences too young to remember his silent films, demonstrated that the skills he had developed as a child being thrown across stages had not diminished with age. He was in his 60s now, but he could still fall. He could still take the punishment. The stone face still held, though now it was the face of an old man rather than a young one, lined with decades of pain that the mask could not entirely hide. In 1952, a film called Limelight brought him back to serious cinema. Charlie Chaplin, his old rival from the silent days, cast Buster in a small but significant role, two aging comedians performing together, two relics of a vanished era supporting each other through one final routine. The scene is almost unbearably poignant. Two geniuses who had once competed for the title of greatest comedian in the world, now united by their shared obsolescence. The critical rehabilitation accelerated through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Retrospectives of his silent work drew enthusiastic crowds. Film schools began teaching his techniques. A new generation of comedians cited him as their primary influence, not Chaplin with his sentiment, but Keaton with his precision, his engineering, his understanding that comedy could be built like a machine. James R.G. wrote an essay in Life magazine that many credit with cementing Buster's reputation. Keaton's face, R.G. wrote, ranked almost with Lincoln's as an early American archetype. It was haunting, handsome, almost beautiful, yet it was also irreducibly funny. The comparison to Lincoln, another face defined by sadness, by perseverance, by the refusal to surrender, captured something essential about what Buster Keaton represented. In 1965, Buster Keaton was invited to the Venice Film Festival, where a retrospective of his work would be screened for audiences who regarded him as one of the masters of cinema. He was 70 years old, had survived everything that life and Hollywood had thrown at him, and was finally being recognized as what he had always been. The reception was overwhelming. Audiences cheered his silent films as if they were new releases rather than 40-year-old relics. Critics wrote rapturous reviews comparing him favorably to artists in every medium. He was treated like the genius he was, rather than the embarrassment Hollywood had decided he had become. But Buster's health was failing. The years of alcoholism had damaged his body in ways that no amount of sobriety could repair. The decades of performing dangerous stunts had left him with injuries that compounded as he aged. The lung cancer that would eventually kill him was already growing, though he did not yet know it. He continued working until the very end. His final film appearance was in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, released in 1966. He was visibly frail, a shadow of the physical marvel he had once been, but he could still fall, he could still take the punishment. The skills that had been beaten into him as a child remained, even as everything else was failing. On February 1, 1966, Buster Keaton died of lung cancer at his home in Los Angeles. Eleanor was with him, as she had been for the past 25 years, as she would continue to be in memory for decades after his death. He was 70 years old. He had been a performer for 68 of those years, had been famous for most of them, had been forgotten and then remembered, had been broken and then rebuilt, had been thrown across stages and thrown out of studios and thrown away by an industry that did not understand what it possessed until after it was gone. Walk into any film school today, ask the professors who invented physical comedy as we know it, who developed the grammar of visual gags that every comedian since has borrowed, who proved that silence could be more eloquent than speech. They will say Buster Keaton. Watch any action comedy made in the past 50 years. Watch Jackie Chan planning elaborate stunts with the precision of an engineer. Watch the Coen brothers constructing visual jokes that build like Rube Goldberg machines. Watch Wes Anderson framing shots with the geometric perfection that Keaton pioneered. They are all his children, whether they know it or not. The silent films remain astonishing. Sherlock Jr. looks like it could have been made yesterday. The dream logic, the meta-commentary on cinema itself, the technical innovations that modern filmmakers still study trying to understand how he achieved them. The General is regularly voted one of the greatest films ever made, its train sequences so elaborate and dangerous that no studio would permit them today. Steamboat Bill Jr. contains that falling building facade, still the most audacious stunt in comedy history, still capable of making audiences gasp nearly a century after it was filmed. But the legacy extends beyond the films. Buster Keaton proved that comedy could be art, that physical humor could carry the same weight and meaning as any drama, that a face without expression could communicate more than 1,000 words of dialogue. He elevated his medium by refusing to accept its limitations. The stone face that became his trademark was never really about not feeling. It was about feeling everything and choosing not to show it, about maintaining dignity in the face of chaos, about surviving whatever life threw at you without letting it see you flinch. He had learned that lesson as a child, being thrown across stages by his father. He had practiced it as a filmmaker, being thrown away by Hollywood. He had perfected it as an old man, being thrown back into the spotlight by critics who finally understood what they had been watching all along. There is a story that Keaton told after her husband's death. She said that in all their years together, in all the decades of their marriage, she had only seen Buster smile, truly smile, with genuine happiness rather than performance, a handful of times. He didn't know how, she said. It had been trained out of him so early. The stone face wasn't an act. It was who he was. He had learned as a child that showing emotion got you hurt, and he never unlearned it, no matter how safe I tried to make him feel. The stone face was his gift to the world, and his curse upon himself. It made him immortal on screen and isolated him in life. It allowed him to perform miracles and prevented him from experiencing ordinary human connection. It was the mask that made him famous, and the prison that kept him alone. In his final interview, conducted just months before his death, Buster was asked if he had any regrets. He considered the question with the same careful attention he had brought to constructing gags, the same precision he had applied to every aspect of his work. "I regret that I wasn't nicer to my first wife," he said. "I regret that I didn't spend more time with my sons when they were young. I regret the drinking, though I suppose everyone regrets that." He paused. The stone face held, as it always held, revealing nothing. "I don't regret the falls. I don't regret the stunts. I don't regret the work. The work was the only thing that ever made sense to me." The man who made the world laugh never learned how to smile. He was thrown across stages before he could walk, taught that his pain was entertainment, trained to hide every emotion behind a mask of stone that became more real than whatever was beneath it. He created masterpieces that still astound. He performed stunts that still terrify. He built a career on the precise mechanics of falling, and then watched helplessly as his own life fell apart in ways he could not control. Hollywood gave him everything and then took it all away. The studio, the creative control, the dignity that he had earned through decades of dangerous, brilliant work. He spent 20 years as a ghost, haunting an industry that had forgotten him, surviving only because a woman named Eleanor refused to let him disappear entirely. The resurrection came too late to undo the damage. By the time the world recognized what it had in Buster Keaton, he was already dying, but he kept working until the end, kept falling, kept performing the skills that had been beaten into him as a child and perfected over a lifetime of pain disguised as comedy. The next time you watch someone fall in a movie, the next time you laugh at a physical gag, the next time you marvel at a comedian who seems to have no regard for their own safety, remember who invented that. Remember who proved it could be art. Remember who paid the price so that everyone who followed could benefit. Remember Buster Keaton. Remember the stone face. Remember the man who forgot how to smile. That is his legacy. That is his tragedy. And now you know.